Hi, here's a brief update as we start now into Unit 4, and as you see here on the heading, I put down to encourage you a little bit that we're closing in on the midterm for the course. I want to revisit a concept from Unit 2, which you will recall was where Knight presented his partnering principles. And you might remember that reflection paper prompt where I asked you to write about what we do in a partnering environment when a member says no. Most of you really handled that very well. And the gist of it was that, you stay true to the process and you keep asking why might a person say no, and you just keep drilling and drilling and finally hoping to reach some consensus. But I just want to clarify a little bit. I think some people come away from their first reading of this book thinking that Jim Knight might be a little soft, and that maybe it's because he hasn't really been a building leader himself. I know some of my own colleagues at the university probably don't think this is a great book for this kind of a course. I would really differ with that, of course, and you know that because I did choose the book. But I love Knight's observation on page 24, where, borrowing from the work of Thomas Davenport, he reminds us that teachers are knowledge workers. And further, knowledge workers don't like to be told what to do. And as Knight further reminds us, people don't tend to do well in meeting goals that were set for them by others. You might remember the somewhat humorous anecdote he wrote about a guy choosing a weight loss plan for his wife, for example, and how successful would that ever be. There is, however, a very important nuance to that whole idea of saying no. And as I said before, many of you hit it right on the head when you wrote that a very thorough and complete process will reduce the number of no responses. I truly believe that. However, if you read Knight closely, you will realize that he does not advocate anarchy in any way. Remember his little analogy about traffic signals in New York and how without them it would come to a grinding stop. It would be chaotic. He's actually a huge proponent of structure. I know a couple of you in here have actually heard him speak, and I'll bet you would attest to that were we able to gather in a classroom somewhere, which I still wish we really could, but we're doing the best we can in this online environment. But he would advocate, meaning Knight, that the structure comes from a partnering process, a thorough collaboration, if you will. And probably the supreme target of that, the supreme symbol of that would be that one-page target that you then covered in the next chapter. I told you early in the course that I'm a huge proponent of PLCs. I don't want to step on any toes because I've read some really great comments by some of you about how well PLCs are working in your buildings. I'm really encouraged to hear that because for a long time, as I traveled around mostly the Colorado Springs area, I did not see PLCs being done very well. They were usually, in my terms, hijacked by curriculum people and used to produce products, maybe curriculum maps or curriculum guides or other things, and they were not ever intended to do that. There is a time and place to get groups of people together to write curriculum and to adjust it. We'll even talk about that a little bit later in Knight's book. But that is not the intent of PLCs. The intent of PLCs, which we'll get into greater detail probably in Unit 6 or 7, is to have people who teach similar courses or like courses look at student work and from that decide how they can do better. But I digress. I was such a fan of the concept that I actually went to the Chicago area, to Lincolnshire, Nebraska, and visited Stevenson High School for a whole week. It was a tremendous experience. I learned as much about that concept as I possibly could. And at that time, Dufour had long left and went off to make his millions selling books and presenting on PLCs all over the world. But at that time, a guy named Dan Galloway was the principal at Stevenson High School. And I remember sitting in his office and he said, Dave, I am not the authority in this school. And he picked up a little packet of paper. It couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 pages long. And he said, this is the authority in this school. And it was his little packet of their vision and values and mission statement that governs Stevenson High School. Well, the reason I'm taking the time to draw that into the illustration here is that it would not be okay at Stevenson High School to say no to that authority in the school because it had been collaboratively agreed to. It was something that when you signed on, you said, oh yeah, I want to be part of that and I commit to be part of that. Now, if Mr. Galloway had found some teacher to be wanting or lacking in some of the things that were described in that packet, he might give that teacher several options to address that shortcoming. And the teacher could probably choose for himself or herself which of those avenues to take. But the teacher, it would not be an option for the teacher to simply walk away and say, I'm not interested. So to be clear, saying no is an option, but there may be consequences for doing so. Most of you hit that right square on the head. I just wanted to take a little time to go a little deeper into that topic. I can tell from having read a few of your essays at the time I make this video that you mostly appreciated Confessions of a Recovering Knower. I love that essay. I was so pleased at how nicely it fits in with Knight's textbook, especially this chapter. And to me, it drives home the biggest shift in thinking to which I have alluded previously. But it's not only a shift from teaching to learning, but that tremendous shift from instructional leader to lead learner. I think that's really catching fire. I'm starting to hear other people talk about that. In fact, over on the Western Slope in the Eagle School District, the superintendent's title is Superintendent of Schools and Chief Learner. So it's an idea that's not just limited to people who read Jim Knight's book. It's really starting to take off. Just a few words on that one-page target. I've been talking about it quite a bit over the last few weeks. The sample that's on page 58 and 59, and I'm sorry for those of you who have electronic copies of the book, but I hope you can find that, is just a suggestion by Knight for a format and then an accompanying target. It certainly does not have to be written that way. I kind of like it with the little codes for who might be responsible for each piece of it, teachers, even students. I could easily see that you might have parents. They definitely do in Stevenson High School. They actually have a whole thing that parents kind of consent to and sign on to saying, we agree as parents of Stevenson High School students to adhere to the following. And so I just wanted to point out to you that you could write it in more of a narrative fashion if you wanted. That's not the point. It also does not have to be exactly one page. But the idea is that it should be concise and it should be something that can be easily expressed. And I know you've heard that concept before from me. But it should be something that's on everyone's lips and not something you have to go, oh gosh, what is it again that we're working on? Now, how does it fit in with the UIP? I was so pleased to see your discussion board and how well you are already processing that. I want to make sure that you don't think I'm advocating anarchy here. It is the law in the state of Colorado that schools do a unified improvement plan, and the form of it and the procedure of it is very much prescribed by the Colorado Department of Education. Now, some of you who are studying with us from other states, you probably have certain things in place that are very similar. Those are really not for the same purpose as the one-page target. They might say that they are improvement plans, but what they really are accountability plans. In other words, how are we going to tell our public what we are doing to address the mostly AYP goals and instructional plans that underlie that. For a one-page target, I would say that's more for a building to decide, hey, we want to, as a faculty, as a community here, we want to get better at these things so that our kids thrive. And these are the things we're going to do. Now, there can be a close, almost marriage between the two, but they have different purposes. You have to do the things that are prescribed by law. There's no way out of it. You don't have to do the one-page target unless you have a superintendent who tells you to. So it should be something that's more grassroots driven. And what do we really want to do to get better? And most of you grasped that, and I was really glad to see it. There is one principal in town, and I won't mention her by name or her school because it's probably not fair to her, but she was one of the principals that I visited with when I was designing this course. She's highly respected. She has a very high-performing high school. And she told me in a moment of candor, Dave, to tell you the truth, I get a group together, mostly of my leadership team, and we work on that UIP, and we do gather input. But I do not put my teachers through a bunch of brain damage in writing that document. Now, when we're finished with that, we do our own school improvement plan that we all really get into, and we break it down by departments. We have a lot of collaboration. I would really suggest to you that I think that's best practice. So I hope that doesn't sound a little too much like some flamboyant pirate or something, but that's just the best way I think there is to improve schools. I love the quotation from Fullen. You can already tell, I'm sure, that Michael Fullen is one of my favorites. I've had an opportunity to sit in with him several times during my life. But I love that quote that some of you alluded to in the chapter where he says, fat plans don't fly. And that's really true. I had an experience in the Cheyenne Mountain District. The superintendent was hired, and he came in there. He lasted a long time. He did a great job. He's almost legendary in his success there. But when he came in, his claim to fame was strategic planning. And he followed the Bill Cook model, which some of you may have heard about. It's been around forever. And I was fortunate in that I was an assistant principal, but I was included in the strategic planning committee for the whole district. There were 33 of us, as I recall. And we met for a whole week and stayed met in big fancy rooms and had lunches catered, and it was a big, expensive deal. We had members of the faculty, we had members of the community, we had business people that were affiliated with the community, we had a very few administrators, we had a couple board members, and we wrote this massive strategic plan. We turned over copious notes to a typist, basically, to put that all together. And then it was published, and I remember distinctly it was in bright red 3-ring binders, and a lot of people got copies of that, and they went predictably on shelves where they gathered dust for years and years. And lots of times people alluded to it and spoke about it grandly, but I can never, ever remember, and I'm just being honest here, ever really using it with my teachers, ever having a teacher draw up on it to make some kind of a decision. I just never have really been a big believer in those. Now, some of you may have been through strategic planning processes that yielded better results. And if you have, I think that's great. That's mostly anecdotal information, but I like that idea of the one-page target. I think that's something we can embrace. I also asked you to reflect a little bit on the Big Four, and you did an equally great job on that. Just as a point of clarification, as short a period of time as 4 years ago, Knight was calling that community building classroom management. And that's obviously a more traditional term. But I like his expansion of it into community building. Some of you wrote beautifully on that about how, the part of teaching kids to work in a community, on a team, to be a role player, those are important skills. They're much more important now than they were way back even when I was teaching. And I like the way Knight has grown as a writer and kind of expanded that piece of it. You know, I think the beauty of that big four is that sometimes we look at a topic like instruction and we think there is almost an infinite number of effective ways to accomplish good instruction. And I don't think it's true. I think there are limited number of ways that have been researched and proven to be effective, and that we are better spending our time when we choose among those and get proficient at them. We'll look a little bit at Marzano's work along those lines, where he advances, it's not fresh on my mind right now, but I think 9 strategies. And I remember an old book that I used to read and used to teach my class called Models of Learning by an author named Joyce, where there was also a limited number of strategies, although more than Marzano includes. But my point is that we're far better to look at some models that have been proven effective and then get good at them. And when we make nuances, sure, we kind of create other avenues and other pathways, but it's not like it's just out there in the galaxy somewhere and we can just throw something at the wall until it sticks. Knight's making it happen, making it all happen section in that chapter 3, which begins on page 78, is really pretty good stuff. This is another time I wish we were in the classroom together, because we would spend a little more time back and forth in a dialogue about that. A couple highlights in there. That filing method that he suggests is really good. You know, filing things kind of by date and organizing them that way so that when you go back, because if you'll think about it, when you try to recall something that was meaningful, you sort of put it in the perspective of what it is you were working on at that time, what stage you were in. And sometimes that's a fastest way to go back and find some of those notes you were taking or some of those handouts that crossed your desk. It's really a method that works pretty well. And the other thing is the practice of making classroom observations calendar items is crucial. And, you know, every time a person goes into a building leadership position, well, I won't say every time, but almost every time that I've encountered someone who does that, they say, well, I want to be in those classrooms a lot. That's a priority. And then management tasks get in the way, and people start sucking their time, and they start canceling appointments to be in the classroom, and they don't get in there as nearly as many times as they had intended. It happens to the best of us. And most of us learn early on the only way you're going to get in there is to write those observations down as if it's an important appointment with your boss, just like it is. And then you keep that appointment, and your secretary has your calendar and knows that those are times that are sacred, and you're not going to be interrupted, and you're not going to have those times curtailed. So again, that little section tonight, I hate to skim over it like that. I hope you spend a little time. You can keep it as a resource. It's got some really good ideas about handling email, for example, and I would just encourage you to know that that's there. In this new Unit 4, we're going to look at the hottest idea in education over the past few years, and that is the meta-analysis by John Hattie, the New Zealander, entitled Visible Learning. And it's so unique because of how many studies he encompassed to draw his conclusions. He used over 800 meta-analyses. In other words, putting together over 800 studies that were also multiple in nature, and it covers literally millions of students. There's a more user-friendly version of that book. It's his newer book, and it's called Visible Learning for Teachers. It's not quite as statistic-oriented. It's more narrative in its style. Reading that one is far easier to do on your own. If you really want to get the gist of it and use it as a practitioner, I would recommend that one. But both books are really good. I'm going to have you look at a video by a two-part video actually by Hattie. Please don't kill the messenger. He has a style that is a little bit arrogant, a little bit controversial. He's become a big shot, and you can kind of tell when you look at the video that he kind of believes that. But his work is really something, and I'm going to ask you to really reflect on that a little bit. Bringing this to a close, I really want to commend you on your work. I love reading your discussion boards. You're bouncing good ideas off each other. It reads as if it's authentic and not just perfunctory. I like that. I think that's a hard environment to have on an online discussion. And I know I'm keeping you busy, kind of making sure that you're checking in a couple times a week. But hang in there. As I mentioned earlier, you're almost halfway through the course. I want to remind you that my goal is not to tell you how to be an instructional leader, but it's to probe you to explore how you see yourself becoming one and what that would look like for those that would be led by you. About 4 or 5 of you had me for the educational politics course, and so you've seen this quote before, but it's kind of my philosophy in teaching these graduate level courses, and that is a Confucius quotation: by 3 methods we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is noblest; second, by imitation, which is easiest; and third, by experience, which is the most bitter. I can definitely attest to that last line. I was in this business for 32 years and have stayed pretty closely connected to it for the last 10, and I have learned a lot by experience, and I would assure you that's not the best or the most pleasant way. That's why I rely on the reflection piece so much. I think there's more inside you than even you know sometimes. The chapter 4 from Knight is on instructional coaching. Obviously, that is his bailiwick. It is a great chapter. He's one of the best in the profession about that topic. Please don't be quick to dismiss the concept just because you might be in a very small school somewhere, or one that just doesn't have the money to hire instructional coaches, or maybe your community doesn't believe that's a good expense. There are a lot of reasons that a lot of schools don't have instructional coaches. But what I'd like you to do is find the concept of what it is about instructional coaching that makes it so good, and then I'm going to implore you to find ways to use those concepts regardless of what kind of situation you might be in now or what kind of position you project yourself to be in later. Okay, that's it for now. Keep up the great work. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you're gaining from the course.